Imagine a sky so thick with arrows it eclipses the sun. The whistle of wood slicing air, the thud of steel against flesh, the scream of a horse collapsing beneath its knight. Somewhere in the chaos, a teenage girl grips a banner tighter than her own sword, believing that God, not kings, not blood, has chosen her to save a country. Welcome to the 100 Years' War. A conflict that, despite its name, was less a single war and more a series of earthquakes, shattering two kingdoms, defining national identities, and changing the face of Europe forever. But why? Why did France and England, so deeply entwined by bloodlines and alliances, plunge themselves into over a century of bloodshed? Was it only about thrones and titles, or something far deeper, more human? This is a story of power and pride. Yes, but also of fear, resilience, betrayal, and belief. A story shaped not just by kings and commanders, but by farmers taxed into poverty, by archers who rewrote the rules of war, by queens who schemed from behind veils, and by a peasant girl who would dare to speak in the name of heaven. Our journey begins in the year 1328. A French king lies dead with no male heir. Across the Channel, Edward III of England stares at the empty throne of France and claims it should be his after all. His mother was the sister of the deceased king. But French law says no. Only a man can inherit, and the blood of a woman, they say, cannot carry a crown. Thus begins a legal argument turned military campaign as banners rise and borders blur. What follows is not just a dynastic dispute, but a prolonged crisis of identity for both nations. France, fractured and feudal, struggles to unite. England, still tethered to its Norman past, clings to its holdings across the sea. The war will transform both, and leave scars that outlast even the graves of its heroes. You may know the names: Edward the Black Prince, Henry V, Charles the Mad. But behind the titles were men aging in armor, burdened by glory and illness alike. Behind their armies marched mercenaries, thieves, boys not old enough to marry. And then came the plague. As war thundered on, a black wind swept through towns and villages, killing millions and halting the conflict, not with a treaty, but with silence. And when the fighting resumed, it had changed. War had evolved. The knight in shining armor was no longer invincible. The longbow had arrived. Battles like Crécy and Agincourt were not just victories, they were revolutions in warfare, heralding the rise of the common soldier. The myth of chivalry cracked beneath the weight of real blood, and the dream of glory soured into the reality of carnage. And yet, amid this chaos, hope flickered in the most unexpected form. A peasant girl from Domremy. She heard voices. Saints, she said, spoke to her, and those voices led her to the Dauphin, the uncrowned king of France. At just 17, she convinced him to give her an army, and with it she broke the siege of Orleans, shifting the momentum of the entire war. She became a symbol not just of divine favor, but of national unity. In a kingdom that had barely called itself a nation, her name was Jeanne. You might know her as Joan of Arc, burned alive before she reached 20, but never forgotten. Not by France, not by history. As the war dragged into its final decades, something else began to emerge: the modern state. England, once a patchwork of lords and counties, developed a stronger central government to fund its never-ending campaigns. France, battered by invasions and internal strife, grew more unified in resistance. By the war's end in 1453, both kingdoms were no longer medieval relics. They were proto-modern nations, shaped by necessity, defined by survival. And though the fighting stopped, the legacy of those 100 years never really did. It lived on in the War of the Roses in England, in the centralization of power in France, and in the very notion of what it meant to be English or French. But this story is not just about nations. It is about people, about a merchant in Bordeaux who lent everything he had to support a king's gamble, about a mother in Rouen who watched her son marched off to war and never saw him again, about a Scottish warrior who died in France fighting a war that was not his, about a king who returned to captivity by choice because his honor demanded it. It is about how war stretches across generations, how sons fight the battles their fathers could not finish, and how, sometimes, history is moved not by the strongest, but by the most unexpected. So settle in. Let the clash of steel and the whisper of parchment draw you in. We will journey together across muddy fields and candlelit courts, across betrayal and bravery, across the forgotten and the legendary. This is not just a tale of kings and castles. It is the story of how identity is forged, how power is challenged, and how, sometimes, even the smallest voice can shake the course of history. The spark that ignited 100 years of war was not lit on a battlefield. It was struck in the halls of French succession, inside velvet-draped courts, where crowns rested heavier than steel. In 1328, the Capetian dynasty of France faced a crisis it had not seen in centuries, the death of Charles IV without a male heir. Suddenly, the greatest kingdom in Europe found itself without a king and with too many claimants eager to fill the vacuum. Now, medieval Europe was no stranger to blood disputes over thrones. But this one, it had all the makings of a royal Twitter feud on steroids, only with sword fights, sieges, and tens of thousands dead. At the heart of the mess stood Edward III of England. Young, ambitious, and already king in his own realm, Edward had a trump card that he was all too eager to play. His mother, Isabella, was the sister of the late King Charles. That made Edward, in his view, the rightful heir to the French throne. After all, who had a closer bloodline? But France did not see it that way. They invoked an ancient, if somewhat selectively applied, legal principle, Salic law. It barred inheritance of the crown through the female line. Essentially, since Isabella was a woman, her blood did not count. Never mind that it carried royal French lineage. Never mind that Edward was the closest male relative. Under Salic law, the throne passed instead to Philip of Valois, a cousin on the male side, to the French. This was not only legal, it was essential. Inheritance had to be clean, male, and unquestionable, lest the kingdom fracture under rival factions. But to Edward, it felt like theft disguised as tradition. And here's where things get more tangled. Because this was not just a legal debate, it was a collision between two different political cultures. France, vast and decentralized, leaned on tradition to keep the patchwork kingdom together. The Capetian line had ruled for centuries, and legitimacy was their anchor. England, on the other hand, was emerging from a period of internal consolidation. Edward had already begun asserting his authority over rebellious lords, and now he had ambitions across the Channel. The idea that French nobles could simply exclude him based on a rule that had not been consistently enforced before, that was personal, that was war. Think of it like this. Imagine a massive family-owned company where the CEO dies unexpectedly. The boardroom scrambles. One faction backs a male cousin who has been in the background but technically fits the succession plan. Another faction supports the CEO's daughter's son, the golden boy, who is already running his own division overseas. He is ambitious, competent, and deeply connected to the company's legacy. But the board says, sorry, our rules say women, and therefore their sons do not count. The golden boy disagrees. vehemently, and decides to sue. Only in the 14th century, lawsuits came with swords, not subpoenas. But Edward's claim was not merely personal, it was political gold. By asserting himself as the rightful king of France, he was not just grabbing at glory, he was offering English nobles, soldiers and merchants a cause, a purpose, and, most importantly, profit. Land, titles, plunder, all dangled as rewards, in a campaign to take what he saw as rightfully his. The war would not just be a struggle for a throne, it would be a crucible for a new kind of nationalism. And yet, for all the grandeur of kings and crowns, it was the ordinary people who would carry the burden. The peasants of Gascony did not care whether a crown rested on Edward's head or Philip's. They cared about whether their wheat would be burned, whether their sons would be conscripted, whether their homes would be looted again. To them, the succession crisis was less about laws and lineage and more about survival. But the banners went up, the horses were saddled, and the drums of war began to beat. It is worth pausing here to consider just how fragile peace was in this world. A kingdom could rise or fall based on the legitimacy of a single birth. There were no DNA tests, no photo evidence, just scrolls, rumors, and the proclamations of powerful men. In that fog, war was always waiting. And the 100 Years' War was no accident. It was the predictable consequence of a medieval Europe built on dynastic ambition, military prestige, and legal gray zones that could be twisted to suit a crown's convenience. But Edward did not invade right away. He waited, he watched, and he prepared. Before any swords clashed, there was diplomacy. Spies whispered in courts, alliances were bartered in candlelit chambers, and marriages were arranged like military maneuvers. In this shadow war, Edward courted support among discontented French lords, promising them favor and fortune if they would back his claim. The stage was set long before a single arrow was loosed. Eventually, the tension became unbearable. Edward crossed the Channel, not just with soldiers, but with a banner bearing the lilies of France beside the lions of England. A bold, dangerous symbol, he was not just a king invading foreign soil, he was declaring himself the rightful ruler of that soil. What followed was not swift conquest, but the slow bleed of decades. Battles would be won and lost, alliances forged and broken, and the original claim would blur in the minds of those fighting. By the end, few would remember exactly why the war had begun. But the world they inherited would bear its shape. And so the first stone had been cast not by fire or steel, but by a disputed birthright, a mother's name, and a king's refusal to be ignored. The drums of war had sounded, and now the crown's claim was riding not just on royal parchment, but on the backs of soldiers, thousands of them. Among the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War, one battle would become a brutal thesis statement for what this conflict would become, the Battle of Crécy in 1346. And it did not just mark a victory. It shattered centuries of military tradition. In a single bloody afternoon, for generations, the heavy cavalry had been the undisputed king of the battlefield. Armored knights, born into privilege, trained from childhood, rode into combat like demigods, tall, fast, and unstoppable. Infantry might hold a line, but it was the charge of mounted nobility that was expected to decide the day. That belief would die in the mud of Crécy. Edward III's army, though outnumbered nearly 2-1, held a strategic position on a gently sloping hill near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in northern France. His troops, well-disciplined and tactically arranged, waited as the French advanced in chaos. And waiting with them, strung along the flanks and center, were thousands of English longbowmen men, who, for the first time in European history, would turn the tide of battle, not from horseback, but from behind a wooden bow. To modernize, the longbow does not look like much, just a curved stave of yew, roughly 6 feet in length. But in the hands of a trained archer, it was a weapon of terrifying power. With a draw weight of over 100 pounds, it could hurl a bodkin point arrow clean through plate armor from over 200 yards away. Even at lower ranges, its sheer velocity crushed bones, pierced mail, and turned armored men into ragdolls. It was, quite literally, the great equalizer. On that day at Crécy, it became medieval Europe's version of shock therapy. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged the English lines, banners flapping, lances gleaming, and were torn apart before they could even close the gap. The arrows fell not in twos or threes, but in blackened swarms, darkening the sky, whistling like a storm of needles. Horses shrieked and toppled. Knights fell by the dozens, many trampled by their own men. The French crossbowmen, hampered by wet strings and poor coordination, were cut down before they could reload. Discipline broke. Panic set in. The field turned red. It was not just a battle, it was a warning. The old ways were dying. And while the nobles wrote dispatches and the kings revised their maps, one of the many who stood behind the English lines that day was a man named Will Fletcher. Not a knight, not a noble, just a yeoman archer from a small village outside Shrewsbury. Like thousands of others, Will had been drafted into service through England's compulsory archery laws, an unspoken deal between crown and commoner. Protect the realm, and we won't forget your name. He woke that morning with fingers still sore from the last day's shooting. His linen undercoat clung to his back, damp with nervous sweat, as he stepped over sleeping comrades and chewed a piece of hard biscuit. The French were near, and the captains had warned them to keep their arrows dry. Will had 4 dozen in his quiver, sharp, barbed, and lethal. His bow, 6 feet of hand-carved yew, was waxed and strung. He muttered a prayer to St. George, not because he was pious, but because his father had said it helped. As the horn sounded and the horizon filled with armored shapes, Will tightened the bracer on his wrist and found his stance. He remembered the captain's words, "You do not aim for the man. You aim for the sky and let gravity finish the job." So he did. 1 arrow, then another, then another. By midday he had fired over 100. His arms trembled, his fingers blistered. He had seen a French knight fall, screaming with an arrow through his eye, his gilded armor offering no defense. He had seen a horse rear and throw its rider, only to be crushed beneath the weight of its own brothers. He had watched men drown in mud, slipping on their own blood. And still, the arrows flew. That night, as the moans of the dying echoed through the dark and bonfires crackled over the corpse-strewn field, Will sat with a whetstone and cleaned what arrows he had left. He said nothing. Neither did his comrades. They had won, yes, but the victory had not felt like glory. It had felt like work. Dirty, brutal work. And this was the beginning. What Crécy revealed brutally, irrevocably, was that warfare was evolving. The longbow, in the hands of commoners like Will, had overturned the social and military hierarchy of Europe. It was not the knight in shining armor who decided the battle anymore. It was the muddy-footed man who could pull 100 pounds of draw weight again and again under a rainstorm of screams. Edward III's strategy at Crécy combined terrain, weather, and discipline with deadly effectiveness turning an outnumbered force into a machine of attrition. To the French, it was a humiliation. To the English, a vindication. And to military historians today, it stands as one of the clearest signals that the feudal world of chivalry was collapsing under the weight of modernity. It would not be the last time English archers dominated a battlefield. Poitiers and Agincourt would follow, both driven by the same wooden weapon that made nobility bleed, like everyone else. In a war born of royal bloodlines, it was the sweat of the archer that paved the road to victory. Victory, as it turns out, does not come cheap. After Crécy, Edward III had the momentum. His armies were experienced, his longbowmen were feared, and his claim to the French throne, now backed by blood and arrows, seemed closer than ever. But war is not just about soldiers and strategy. It is about silver. And by the mid-14th century, Edward was nearly bankrupt. Behind every glorious battlefield stood a mountain of debt. Wars in the medieval world were not paid for with government budgets or central banks. There was no treasury printing coins by fiat, no public war bonds to rally patriotism. Instead, kings turned to the only people who could afford to bankroll a campaign that spanned decades: merchants. Florence, Bruges, Genoa, London. These were not just cities, they were lifelines. Networks of banking families, some with more influence than monarchs, extended enormous loans, often at steep interest. In return, they demanded land, trade rights, titles, even repayment through entire regions' tax revenues. And if a king failed to pay, entire banking houses collapsed. Or they shifted allegiance. Take the Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence, two of the most powerful financial institutions of the day. At Edward's request, they opened their vaults to the tune of hundreds of thousands of florins. This was no small sum. In modern terms, it was akin to funding a major national defense project entirely on private credit. And so, picture this. A fictionalized but historically grounded scene in 1338. In a candlelit hall in Florence, the future of the 100 Years' War hangs on a conversation not between generals, but between a king and a banker. "My lord," the merchant said carefully, fingers drumming against polished oak, "you ask for 200,000 florins. My house can grant this under terms." Edward III sat forward, every part the monarch save for his eyes, which betrayed a deep weariness. He had fought his own barons for control, crossed the channel with his banners flying, and now he found himself negotiating like a merchant's apprentice. "You know my claim is just," Edward replied. "France is mine by blood, and their crown must fall. You finance this war, and I will repay it tenfold when Paris kneels." The banker smiled without warmth. "Paris is a long ride from here, your grace, and coins do not march. Coins are moved." There was a silence, heavy with tension. "Then name your price." "Exclusive rights to export English wool through Flanders, a 6% annual yield on the loan, and collateral titles, trade posts, or tax levies. You understand, of course, war is a risky venture." Edward clenched his jaw. He did not have the wool to give, not without sparking fury among English merchants. But he needed the money. Arrows had to be bought, horses fed, soldiers paid. War, for all its banners and glories, ran on coin. These deals were not rare. They were the engine of conflict. When Edward's debts spiraled, he leaned harder on English merchants, such as William de la Pole, a wool trader turned royal financier who personally fronted enormous sums to keep the campaign alive. In exchange, he received not just payment, but prestige, eventually being elevated to earl. Money in this era could buy more than comfort, it could buy noble blood. To make good on these debts, Edward had to promise future tax revenues. Towns were pressured, wool exports were heavily controlled, and tariffs were redirected straight into lenders' pockets. Entire regions of England became fiscal engines, feeding the war machine. Sound familiar? Today, nations fund conflicts with defense budgets, bonds, and central bank policy. They issue debt to the public, print money when necessary, and manipulate interest rates to sustain campaigns that last years or decades. In that sense, the 100 Years' War was a primitive prototype of the same machine, just without the paper trails or macroeconomic models. Instead of bondholders, there were Italian families. Instead of central banks, merchant guilds. But the logic unchanged. Wars are fought by soldiers but financed by books, ledgers, and interest-bearing promises. And this was not just an English game. The French crown, too, leveraged local noble families and foreign financiers. As the war dragged on, both sides found themselves tangled in a web of debt, diplomacy offering favors and rights that often outlived the kings who made them. When the Bardi and Peruzzi eventually collapsed, due in large part to Edward's unpaid loans, it shook Florence's economy to its core, sending ripples through Europe. This financial instability had a feedback loop. As debts piled higher, taxes increased. And when taxes rose, so did resentment. By 1381, England erupted in the Peasants' Revolt, driven in part by fury over a poll tax meant to fund the continuing war. The very people who bled for England were now bleeding at home to pay for it. The irony is almost medieval in its cruelty. The archer at Crécy may have won Edward his glory, but it was the merchant in Florence who gave him the means. Without the loans, the war might have ended in months. With them, it lasted generations. While kings debated bloodlines and merchants counted coin, something far older and more unforgiving crept across the land. The war had stalled not because of treaties or strategy, but because of a microscopic invader. In 1348, as the 100 Years' War entered its second decade, the Black Death arrived in Europe like a dark wind, silent at first, then everywhere. And in a world already stretched thin by war, it hit like a hammer on cracked stone. Whole villages vanished in weeks. Towns went quiet. Armies disbanded mid-campaign, not from defeat, but from decay. Horses wandered untethered. Fields went unplowed. Bodies were stacked like firewood in carts, and the line between battlefield and graveyard grew tragically thin. In rural Normandy, one woman named Agnes, though fictional, represents many thousands whose stories never made the chronicles. She lived in a small thatched cottage on the edge of Roumois, surrounded by fields that had grown lean from years of overtaxation. Her husband had died the previous winter of a fever. Her son, Etienne, 17, had just come of age and was tall enough to draw a longbow. He was gone by spring, taken not by the plague, but by the war. When Edward's army pushed into northern France in one of its many phases, troops were needed more and more, and Etienne had been pressed into service by a local lord who still owed debts to the crown. Agnes had cried, of course, but she had not fought it. Everyone had lost something. Why should she be any different? Then the plague came. It started with her neighbor's boy, coughing blood one morning and dead by sundown. Then her sister. Then the priest who came to bury them. Within days the roads emptied. The market shuttered. and smoke from hastily burned bodies hung like fog over the horizon. Agnes locked her door and covered the cracks with damp cloth. She waited and prayed, though she was not sure to whom anymore. What made it worse was not just the sickness. It was the war taxes that kept coming. The messengers did not bring food or medicine. They brought parchment, marked with wax, demanding grain for the troops and coin for the crown. She had neither. She bartered what she could, gave up her last 2 hens, and watched the remaining goats starve. But still, no word came from Etienne. Had he died in battle? Or worse, alone in a trench, coughing like her neighbor's boy, buried nameless in a foreign field? She would never know. Agnes was not unusual. Across Europe, the plague claimed between 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. And unlike war, it did not care about lineage, title, or allegiance. Kings and peasants died alike. Cities lost records. Churches lost priests. Entire noble families vanished in a month. And the war, it paused not out of mercy, but necessity. Armies cannot march without people. The effects were deeper than just death. Survivors like Agnes emerged into a transformed world. Labor shortages forced lords to offer higher wages. For the first time in generations, a plowman could ask for better terms and get them. The feudal economy cracked, if not broke. Some serfs walked off their land and never returned, finding work in towns that were desperate for strong hands. Prices wobbled, guilds weakened, and power, slowly, unevenly began to shift from the noble to the common. And in the shadows of plague and politics, resentment simmered. People like Agnes did not forget that even in their darkest hour the taxman came, that the church offered penance, not comfort, that kings kept fighting, even as their subjects buried children with their bare hands. This pressure would boil over in time. In England it exploded as the peasants' revolt of 1381, a wave of rebellion triggered by war debt, plague recovery, and a populace that had nothing left to give. In France it seeded a more subtle but no less powerful transformation, the beginning of a national consciousness, forged not just in war but in shared survival. And what of Etienne? Perhaps he survived. Perhaps he came home years later, changed by blood and time. Or perhaps Agnes never saw him again. Like many, she carried her grief in silence. While the kings resumed their campaigns and historians wrote only of treaties, sieges, and thrones, but beneath all, beneath the crowns and coin, was the human cost. Agnes reminds us that the 100 Years' War was not fought only by knights in gleaming armor, but by mothers, farmers, and forgotten sons. They did not write the history, but they lived it. The years dragged on. The war bled into decades, the plague returned in waves, and kings came and went. By the early 1400s, the conflict had twisted into something far more than a dynastic dispute. It was now a crisis of national survival. And just as hope seemed to wither in the ash of siege and occupation, a teenage girl from Domremy lit a match that would change everything. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc in English, and her story is so extraordinary, so unlikely, it risks sounding like myth. But it is history, verifiable, documentable, and powerful. She was born a peasant, illiterate, untrained in battle, and with no noble blood. Yet at 17 she would walk into a royal court, speak with kings and generals, lead armies, and ultimately sway the fate of a nation. How? Not by politics, not by birthright, but by belief. Joan claimed she heard voices, specifically the voices of saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. They instructed her to drive the English from France, and see that the Dauphin Charles VII was crowned at Reims. Her conviction was unshakable. It was not strategy that drew people to her, but spiritual certainty. In a fractured country desperate for meaning, Joan did not just offer hope, she embodied it. Her arrival at the besieged city of Orléans in 1429 electrified the French people. Soldiers, long demoralized, began to believe again, but her impact went beyond battlefields. Joan redefined what power looked like. In a world dominated by male lineage, political maneuvering, and aristocratic entitlement, she introduced a radically different voice, the voice of the common, the spiritual, and the silenced. And it reached places the king's envoys never could. Imagine this moment, deep inside the battered city of Orléans. Food is scarce, disease festers, and English siege lines choke off every road. Among the hungry is Margot, a 12-year-old girl whose father had been conscripted and lost to war. She lives with her aunt in a crumbling home near the outer walls, scavenging scraps and trading bread for candles. Then Joan arrives. Margot hears whispers at first. A girl in white armor, riding a white horse, carrying a banner with golden lilies. People say she was sent by God, that she talks to saints, that she laughs in the face of English cannonballs. One morning, Margot pushes her way through the crowd and sees Joan herself mud-spattered, eyes fierce, sword sheathed. Their eyes meet. Joan offers no grand speech, just a nod, a look that says, "I see you." For Margot, that is enough. She does not pick up a sword, she does not charge into battle. But from that day on, she stops being afraid. She brings water to the wounded. She learns how to bind wounds. She tells the other children that the English will fall, because if Joan can rise, maybe they all can. And Joan does rise. She breaks the siege of Orléans in just 9 days. Not through brute force, but with speed, faith, and sheer defiance. The French forces, inspired by her presence, retake strongholds one after another. She leads with a combination of military audacity and moral clarity, something no noble general had offered for decades. Eventually, she escorts Charles VII to Reims for his coronation. A symbolic gesture, yes, but a powerful one. France was no longer simply resisting. It was reclaiming itself. Of course, her story does not end in triumph. She is captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, sold to the English, put on trial for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen at just 19. But even in death, her influence grows. 25 years later, the Church revisits her trial and declares it unjust. Centuries after that, she is canonized as a saint. Today, she is remembered not only as a heroine of France, but as one of the most remarkable figures in all of human history. But perhaps the most radical thing about Joan was not just her military success. It was her ability to shift narrative. She redefined patriotism. She reframed God not as a distant monarch's right, but as a voice that could speak to peasant girls. She was the first true national symbol for France, not a king, not a noble house, but a teenager who carried conviction like armor. And in that, she belongs in a lineage that stretches far beyond the 15th century. In many ways, Joan of Arc is a spiritual ancestor of modern figures like Malala Yousafzai, young women, who emerge from silence, claim space, and speak truth in ways that power cannot ignore. Like Joan, Malala's voice was forged in conflict, hers in the valleys of Pakistan under Taliban rule, where education for girls was forbidden. Like Joan, Malala was targeted, shot, and survived. And like Joan, she refused to step back. She chose to speak louder. Both are proof that when the world is on fire, it is often the unheard who carry the torch. Joan's fire did not just burn the English siege lines, it lit the path forward. She gave France something no king or army could offer, a reason to believe again. And centuries later, her voice defiant, divine and human, still echoes in the walls of Orléans, and in every soul who dares to rise against the odds. Joan of Arc lit the match, but it was France that carried the flame. After her death in 1431, the war did not end overnight. If anything, her execution deepened the resolve of the French. Her martyrdom became not just a symbol of resistance, but a moral imperative. The cause she had lived and died for, Charles VII's legitimacy, was no longer just royal politics. It had become national identity. And slowly, methodically, France began to push back. This was no longer the France of crumbling castles and fragmented duchies. Charles VII, once mocked as the King of Bourges for ruling only a rump of the country, began to reshape his realm. He built a professional standing army, paid in coin rather than loyalty, trained and maintained year-round. For the first time, France was learning how to fight as a nation, not as a patchwork of feudal lords. He reformed taxation, streamlined administration, and curbed the power of the great magnates. The French monarchy, battered by war, began to centralize. It became leaner, more ruthless, and more modern. It had to, because if it did not evolve, it would not survive. Meanwhile, the tide of battles shifted. Key English strongholds began to fall. Paris was retaken. Normandy, once the English crown's ancestral homeland, crumbled. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 and the final blow at Castillon in 1453 sealed England's fate. Cannons now dominated the field symbols of the new age of warfare, and the English, spread thin and poorly funded, could not adapt fast enough. Gascony, held by England for 3 centuries, fell with barely a whimper. The 100 Years' War was over, but victory and defeat are rarely clean in history. For France, the end of the war meant rebirth. A new monarchy emerged, centralized, more absolutist, and increasingly insulated from the feudal chaos of the past. The king was no longer just a warlord, he was the embodiment of France. Nationalism, though still embryonic, had been born in fire. You can draw a straight line from Charles VII to the Sun King, Louis XIV. The idea of l'État, c'est moi, I am, the state, has its roots, not in Versailles, but in Orléans, Reims and Castillon. The French crown emerged from the ashes with purpose and momentum, but across the Channel, England was unraveling. The end of the war should have brought peace. Instead, it brought a vacuum. The very idea of English identity, so long tied to France, to glory abroad, to a king's divine right to rule foreign lands, collapsed. What filled that vacuum was civil war. In 1455, just 2 years after the fall of Bordeaux, England plunged into the War of the Roses, a dynastic nightmare of shifting allegiances, rival claims, and noble infighting that would last for 30 years. York versus Lancaster. Brother versus cousin. Blood on English soil once again. Why? Because unlike France, England had failed to evolve. Its crown remained entangled in noble politics. Its military lacked structure. Its economy was strained by decades of overreach. And most of all, its people were tired. Tired of taxation, tired of failure, tired of kings who promised glory and delivered ruin. It is ironic. England, the early aggressor, the kingdom that once marched triumphantly through French fields, was now broken and bloodied on its own turf. While France rose, England folded inward, grasping at power, cannibalizing itself. And yet from that chaos, both nations were forged anew. For France, the 100 Years' War was the crucible in which monarchy was tempered into national sovereignty. It produced a stronger crown, a clearer identity, and the first flickers of what would become the modern state. For England, the war marked the end of medieval ambition. No more grand continental empires. Instead, the island kingdom would eventually refocus toward internal consolidation, toward naval exploration, and eventually empire building of a different kind. It is tempting to think in terms of winners and losers. But the legacy of the 100 Years' War is more subtle than that. It is not just about land won or lost. It is about transformation, about how war does not just move borders, it reshapes societies. And in that way, the war never really ended. Its echoes lived on in royal policies, in parliaments, in revolts and reforms. It whispered in the background of the French Revolution, the British Empire, and even the trenches of World War I, where French and British soldiers fought once again side by side on blood-soaked soil neither had ever truly left behind. The 100 Years' War did not end with a single treaty or final battle. It ended in exhaustion, military, political, economic, and human. The last English soldier may have left Gascony in 1453, but the consequences of the war would ripple through centuries. It was not just a clash of monarchs or the bloody inheritance of kings. It was a crucible, a test, and in that test, two nations were transformed forever. By now, we have seen how this epic conflict reshaped France. In the ashes of devastation, a new kind of monarchy emerged, leaner, more centralized, more absolute. Charles VII and his successors no longer ruled by noble favor or fragmented custom. They ruled by decree, by administration, by a growing bureaucracy that answered to the crown alone. The seeds of absolutism, later embodied by Louis XIV's famous declaration, "I am the state," were planted not in peace, but in war. The people of France, long divided by region, dialect, and feudal allegiance, began to adopt something new, a national identity. They had fought, not only for king or duchy, but for France itself. Joan of Arc's legacy lived on not just as a religious symbol, but as proof that unity could rise from the chaos of fragmentation. That a girl from a peasant village could witness, inspire nobles and soldiers alike was not just an anomaly, it was a transformation of values. Across the Channel, England's legacy was more complex, more inward, but no less consequential. It entered the war as a rising power, confident and imperial. It exited as a realm in turmoil, ravaged by civil war and self-doubt. The dream of a continental empire had died. What followed was a reckoning. The War of the Roses was not merely a power struggle. It was the delayed cost of an overextended monarchy. The prestige earned on the fields of Crécy and Poitiers had faded into disillusionment. The crown, battered and bankrupt, now had to survive not foreign arrows but internal ambition. Brothers turned on brothers. Legitimacy became a knife. And from that bloody soil would eventually emerge the Tudors, who would redefine English governance, identity, and foreign ambition. Ironically, both countries emerged stronger, but only because they were forced to confront the limits of their medieval systems. War had made that confrontation unavoidable. In this way, the 100 Years' War did more than alter maps. It redefined the very nature of power. It changed how kings ruled not as feudal lords, but as heads of centralized states, It changed how wars were fought, not with chivalric flair, but with strategy, artillery, and logistics. It changed what people believed about loyalty, identity, and duty, not just to a ruler, but to an idea called nation. These were not just surface-level changes. They were foundational. War forced innovation. Longbows broke cavalry supremacy. Gunpowder ended the reign of stone castles. Standing armies replaced temporary levies. Tax systems became permanent. Monarchs no longer begged nobles for troops they paid soldiers directly. And to pay, they taxed. And to tax, they built systems. Thus, modern governance was born not in peace, but in fire. But what about the people? The soldiers, the merchants, the mothers and children like Margot in Orleans, or Agnes in Normandy, who carried the burden of war without ever choosing it. Their voices were rarely recorded, but their impact was real. Their resilience laid the emotional and social groundwork for national recovery. They endured famine, plague, conscription, taxation and loss, and yet rebuilt homes, sowed fields, raised children, and passed on stories. They were the backbone of transformation, even if history remembers only the kings and commanders. Their world changed in ways they could not yet name, and so does ours. Because the 100 Years' War is not just a distant chapter of dusty armor and forgotten monarchs. It is a mirror, a reminder. That war, while tragic, is often a brutal teacher. It strips systems down to their bones and demands adaptation. It is easy to see destruction in battlefields, but far harder, and more important, to see what rises in the aftermath. That is the real legacy, not who won or lost, but what was built in response. France built centralization. England built reform. Both built national myths. And Europe itself took a step toward the modern world, toward sovereignty, diplomacy, military infrastructure, and statehood. And that is why the 100 Years' War still matters. Because today's world is shaped by the crises of the past. Every war, every upheaval, sets into motion cultural, political, and technological waves that carry far beyond the battlefield. It may start with arrows and kings, but it ends in bureaucracy, medicine, science, language, and law. So the question is not just, what did they fight for? It is, what did they become because of it? And by extension, what will we become in our own time of crisis? Because even when war ends, its aftershocks echo for centuries, and we are still listening. So here we are at the end of a war that spanned 5 generations, devoured thousands of lives, and reshaped the identity of nations. And yet, perhaps we are not at the end at all, because when we look back at the 100 Years' War, it does not sit neatly between the dates of 1337 and 1453 like bookends on a shelf. It seeps beyond them into the war-torn fields of the wars of the Roses in England, into the rise of the Valois and Bourbon dynasties in France, into revolutions, reforms, and resurgences that would echo into our modern age. It is easy to treat history like a checklist. Battle, treaty, king, queen. But history is never a closed book. It is a living dialogue. And wars like this one are not just events, but inflection points, pivot moments, stories that mark the moment when everything changes and nothing can return to what it was. So what do we make of this one? Was it a tragedy? Absolutely. So much loss, so much grief. Entire regions razed, families erased, cultures disrupted. The Black Death swept through its chapters like a second enemy, indifferent and indiscriminate. The weight of war pressed down on the backs of peasants, merchants, clergy, and children, but it was also a catalyst. It was through fire and famine that France learned to stand as one. It was through political collapse that England began to reshape its monarchy into something more modern, more accountable, more legalistic, more naval and insular. The canons of Castillon did not just end a war, they began a new era. We live in the world that came after, and here's where this story refuses to close. Because while we know how it ends on paper with the fall of Bordeaux, with England's retreat, with Charles VII consolidating power, we are left with more questions than answers. And that is what makes this story human. What would have happened if Joan of Arc had lived? Could she have continued to unify France beyond the battlefield into law, culture, diplomacy? What if the English crown had won at Orleans and installed a puppet king in Paris? Would France still exist as we know it today? What about the soldiers who returned home, not to parades but to famine and poverty? The archers whose hands were so skilled at war but useless at peace? The women who kept towns running while the lean men marched off to die? We do not always hear their voices in the chronicles, but they lived, they mattered, and their actions quietly reshaped their communities long after the kings had died. And is not that true of every war? When the dust settles, it is the ordinary who carry history forward. So here's a thought. What if we stopped looking at the 100 Years' War as a medieval curiosity, and instead saw it as a lens, a way to understand how power changes hands, how ideology turns into identity, how survival becomes structure? We might realize it was not just a war over a crown, but over what it means to belong, to a land, to a nation, to an idea. That is what makes this history still relevant. Today, we face different wars. Some fought with drones and data, some with misinformation, some with silence, some with protest. And behind each of them, the same timeless questions remain. Who holds power? Who decides the future? And how do people rise when kingdoms fall? If history teaches anything, it is that no system, however old or grand, is immune to change. And that resilience, whether it comes from a prince or a peasant girl with visions, has the power to rewrite entire narratives. So as we step back from the war-torn landscapes of medieval France and England, maybe we take something with us. Not just facts, not just names or battle dates, but a sense of continuity. A knowledge that every age has its crises, and every crisis forces a choice between stagnation or transformation. That was the real legacy of the 100 Years' War. Not who ruled Paris, but who France became because of it. Not how many arrows flew at Agincourt, but how England reimagined itself when the arrows stopped. And maybe, just maybe, as we look at our own world with its fractures, upheavals, and reckonings, we find comfort in that arc. Nations stumble, people suffer, but they adapt, they evolve, they rebuild, and sometimes it is in the longest, darkest chapters that the clearest voices begin to speak. Some wore crowns, some wore armor, and some, like Joan, wore hope. So wherever you are, whether lying in bed with headphones in, walking along a quiet street, or simply letting your thoughts drift through time, I hope this story leaves something behind. A stillness, a spark, a new question to ask. And if you found yourself captivated by these centuries-old echoes, know this, there are more. The 100 Years' War is just one strand in a tapestry of human history. But it is a strand that touches many others, dynasties, rebellions, revolutions, and renaissances. So rest now, but not for long, because the next story is waiting. and history never sleeps.